The fluorescent lights of the regional military logistics hub hummed with a low, irritating buzz that seemed to vibrate right through Captain Avery Thorne's skull. She had been standing in front of the heavy oak desk for nearly 40 minutes, her boots aching and her patience fraying like a worn-out cargo strap. Outside, the heat of the desert afternoon shimmered off the tarmac, but inside the office, the air was cold and smelled of stale coffee and old paper. Avery adjusted the heavy flight bag on her shoulder. She didn't look like someone who had just spent 18 hours in transit, though she felt like it. Her flight suit was dusty, and her hair was pulled back into a tight, no-nonsense knot. She wasn't here for a vacation. She was here because 3 of her team members were pinned down in a valley 600 miles away, and the only way to get them out was a specific piece of machinery that this base happened to have sitting in Hangar 4. "I'm telling you, Sergeant," Avery said, her voice low and steady, trying to keep the edge of desperation out of her tone. "The authorization is coming through the back channels. The communication lines in the north sector are down, which is exactly why I'm standing here in person. I need that Apache cleared for departure by 1700 hours." The man behind the desk, Sergeant Holloway, didn't even look up. He was thick-necked, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of a potato. He was busy stamping a stack of mundane supply requests. Thump, thump. Each strike of the rubber stamp felt like a door closing in Avery's face. "Listen, Captain," Holloway finally said, leaning back. He took a slow, deliberate sip from a chipped mug. "I've got a system. The system requires a digital signature from a commanding officer currently stationed at this hub. Your name isn't on the daily manifest. Your unit designation is classified, which is usually code for, 'I'm making this up.' And frankly, I don't give out multi-million-dollar attack helicopters just because someone has a stressful look on their face." Avery leaned forward, resting her hands on the desk. She didn't raise her voice. "This isn't a stressful look. It's a deadline. If that bird isn't in the air, 3 people who are currently bleeding out in a ravine won't see tomorrow morning. Call the regional director. Call anyone. Just don't tell me about your system while lives are on the line." Holloway let out a short, dry laugh. He looked past her at the few other soldiers waiting in the lobby. He seemed to enjoy the audience. "You pilots are all the same. You think the rules don't apply once you put on the patches, but here on the ground, we follow the book. And the book says you're just a wandering officer with a tall tale and no paperwork. Why don't you take a seat? Maybe by tomorrow, the back channels will find their way to my computer. Until then, the Apache stays in the shed." Avery felt a surge of heat crawl up her neck, but she forced herself to remain still. She knew the type. Holloway wasn't just being a bureaucrat, he was enjoying the power trip. He saw a woman in a flight suit making an impossible request, and he decided his job for the day was to be the wall she couldn't climb over. She turned away from the desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't leave. If she left, she'd have to start the process over at a different base, and she didn't have the fuel or the time. She walked toward the back of the waiting area, a small space with a few plastic chairs and a vending machine that looked older than she was. The lobby was mostly empty, except for a few transport drivers and a man sitting in the far corner. The man in the corner was dressed in a plain, dark tactical jacket and jeans. He didn't look like a soldier, but he didn't look like a civilian either. He was reading a thin manual, but his eyes weren't moving across the page. He was listening. Avery sat down, dropping her bag with a heavy thud. She reached up to rub the back of her neck, a nervous habit she'd developed over years of high-pressure flying. As she tilted her head to the side, the high collar of her flight suit shifted, revealing a thin, jagged scar that ran from just below her ear down toward her collarbone. It wasn't a clean surgical mark. It was a rough, darkened line of skin that looked like a branch of lightning frozen in time. She didn't notice the man in the dark jacket go completely still. In her mind, Avery was already calculating other options. Could she hijack the bird? No, she'd be shot down before she cleared the fence. Could she find a different officer? The base commander was notoriously difficult to reach. She felt a wave of isolation wash over her. It was the same old story. She had the skills, she had the mission, but she didn't have the proper look or the proper stamps to satisfy the people who sat behind desks while others did the work. "Hey, Captain," a voice called out. It was Holloway again, his voice echoing through the quiet lobby. "I just checked the maintenance log. Even if I wanted to help you, that Apache is flagged for a rotor inspection. It's grounded for at least 48 hours. Looks like you're out of luck. Maybe try the motor pool? They might have an old Jeep you can borrow." A few of the drivers in the lobby chuckled. Avery's jaw tightened. The disrespect was deliberate now. It wasn't about the rules anymore. It was about making sure she knew her place. She stood up, ready to go back to the desk and give him a piece of her mind that would likely get her court-martialed. But she didn't care. "Sergeant," she started, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "She wasn't talking to you, Sergeant," a new voice interrupted. It was the man from the corner. He had stood up and was walking toward the desk. He wasn't loud, but there was a weight to his voice that made the entire room go silent. Even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. He walked with a slight limp, but he carried himself like someone who is used to being the most important person in the room. Holloway blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" "This is a restricted area, sir. If you don't have business at the desk." The man didn't stop until he was standing right next to Avery. He didn't look at Holloway. He was looking directly at the scar on Avery's neck. Up close, his eyes were sharp, scanning her with a look of intense recognition, like he was seeing a ghost. "That mark," the man said quietly, ignoring the sergeant entirely. "That happened in the 2016 storm over the ridge, didn't it? The night the sky turned purple and the electronics fried." Avery froze. Nobody knew about that night. It was a black site operation that had been scrubbed from every public record. She looked at the man, really looked at him this time. He looked familiar, but through the haze of her memory, the smoke, the rain, and the screaming of the engines, she couldn't place him. "Who are you?" Avery whispered. The man didn't answer her. Instead, he turned to Holloway. The sergeant was already opening his mouth to yell, but the man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, leather-bound ID case. He flipped it open and pressed it against the glass of the desk. Holloway's face went from smug to ghostly pale in 3 seconds. His hand dropped the rubber stamp. The potato look of his face seemed to sag as he read the credentials of the air marshal standing in front of him. "I suggest you stop talking about Jeeps and start opening that hangar," the marshal said, his voice as cold as the air conditioning. "Because I know exactly who this pilot is, and if she says she needs a bird, you don't ask for a signature. You ask how fast she needs it fueled." The silence in the office was so thick you could hear the clock ticking on the far wall. Sergeant Holloway looked like he had been turned to stone. His eyes darted from the air marshal's badge back to the man's face, then finally to the pilot standing there in her dusty flight suit. The smugness had completely evaporated, replaced by the kind of fear that only comes when a mid-level bully realizes they've just insulted someone very, very important. "Sir, I didn't realize," Holloway stammered, his hands shaking as he pulled the paperwork back toward himself. "The protocol is very strict about unauthorized personnel." And her request didn't have the "forget the protocol," the air marshal said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a sharp edge that cut through Holloway's excuses like a knife. "I am placing this under my personal jurisdiction. If you need a signature, you can use mine. If you need a phone call, Tell your commander to call the regional director's private line. But right now, you are going to pick up that radio and tell the hangar crew to prep that Apache. Now." Holloway didn't wait for a second order. He grabbed the radio handset so fast he nearly knocked over his coffee. As he began barking orders to the maintenance crew, suddenly finding a way to bypass that 48-hour inspection, the air marshal turned back to the pilot. She was still standing there, her hand hovering near the scar on her neck. She looked confused, guarded, and exhausted. "I don't understand," she said softly. "How do you know about that ridge? That mission was buried deep. Even my own flight logs from that month were redacted." The marshal gestured toward the small seating area, away from the prying ears of the transport drivers who were now whispering among themselves. "Let's sit for a moment. They'll need 20 minutes to get the rotors turning anyway." They sat in the plastic chairs. The marshal took off his cap, revealing graying hair and a face lined with years of hard service. He looked at her with a strange kind of gratitude, the kind that usually takes a lifetime to earn. "My name is Vance," he said. 10 years ago, I wasn't an air marshal. I was part of a specialized ground team. We were sent into a valley that didn't exist on any map to retrieve a high-value asset. Things went wrong before we even hit the ground. Our transport took fire, our comms were jammed, and a storm rolled in that the weather report said was impossible. We were trapped on a jagged ridge with no way out and a company of hostiles closing in. The pilot's eyes widened. The memories began to flood back, the smell of ozone. The way the cockpit of her old scout helicopter had groaned under the pressure of the wind, and the terrifying sight of the clouds glowing purple with static electricity. "I remember the radio call," she whispered. "A broken signal. Someone was screaming for an extraction, but command denied the flight. They said the wind speeds were too high for any light bird to fly. They told us to stay grounded and wait for the storm to pass." Vance nodded slowly. "We heard that denial on our end too. We thought we were dead. We were out of ammo, crouching in the mud, listening to the enemy getting closer. And then, through the sound of the thunder, we heard it, a faint hum. One single pilot had ignored this stay grounded order. One pilot decided that the lives of 4 men were worth more than a flight manual safety rating. He pointed to the scar on her neck again. "I was the one who pulled you out of the wreckage after you landed that bird in a space no bigger than a parking spot. When the lightning struck the tail rotor, a surge went through the console. I saw the spark jump. It hit you right there. You were bleeding and half-blinded by the smoke, but you didn't let go of the controls until every single one of us was inside." The pilot looked down at her hands. They were trembling slightly. For years, she had carried that scar as a mark of a mistake, a moment where she had broken the rules and nearly lost her life. She had been reprimanded for that mission, her promotion delayed because she had disobeyed a direct order to stay grounded. She had never been thanked. The mission was so secret that the men she saved were whisked away before she even cleared the medical tent. "I never knew who you were," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They told me the team was fine, but they wouldn't give me names. I thought everyone had forgotten." "I didn't forget," Vance said firmly. "I spent 6 months in the hospital after that tour. Every time I looked in the mirror and saw that I was still breathing, I thought about the pilot with the lightning bolt on her neck. I've spent the last decade working my way up the ladder, partly so I'd have the power to make sure people like you don't get stuck behind desks like Holloway's." He stood up as the low, rhythmic thump of helicopter blades began to vibrate through the floorboards of the office. The sound was coming from the hangar across the lot. The Apache was waking up. "You're not just a pilot to me," Vance continued. "You're the reason I have a daughter who's graduating college next month. You're the reason I'm standing here. So, when I saw you arguing with that man, and I saw that mark, I knew the universe was giving me a chance to settle a debt. Holloway approached them, looking like a beaten dog. He held out a flight helmet and a set of keys to the specialized ignition system of the Ah-64. The bird is prepped, Captain. Fuel is topped off. Weapon systems are hot. I've cleared a direct flight path for you. No stops. The pilot took the helmet, her fingers brushing against the cool plastic. She felt a surge of adrenaline, the exhaustion of the last few hours, replaced by a clear, sharp focus. She looked at Vance, who gave her a crisp, professional salute, one that wasn't required by his rank, but was offered out of pure respect. "Go get your people," Vance said. "And don't worry about the paperwork. I'll be sitting right here at Holloway's desk, making sure every single back channel is wide open for your return." She didn't waste another second. She gripped the helmet, threw her bag over her shoulder, and headed for the heavy steel doors leading to the tarmac. As she stepped out into the heat, the roar of the engines greeted her like an old friend. The heavy glass doors hissed open, and the heat of the airfield hit Captain Avery Thorne like a physical weight. The smell of burnt kerosene and shimmering asphalt filled her senses, but the most beautiful sound in the world was the rhythmic, low-frequency thudding of the Apache's rotor blades. It was a deep, guttural sound that vibrated in her chest, a signal that the machine was alive and waiting for her. She jogged across the tarmac, her flight bag swinging at her side. Behind her, through the tinted windows of the command center, she knew Vance was watching. He had held the door open for her both literally and figuratively. Now, it was up to her to prove that his faith and his memory of her wasn't misplaced. The ground crew was moving with a frantic energy she hadn't seen earlier. 2 technicians were pulling away the external power cables, while another gave her a quick thumbs up from the wing stub. They didn't ask for her ID. They moved because someone very high up had told them to jump, and they were still mid-air. Avery climbed into the cockpit, the familiar cramped space feeling like a second skin. She began her pre-flight checks, her fingers moving across the switches with the speed born of 1,000 hours of practice. Battery on. Fuel pumps engaged. Systems green. The digital displays flickered to life, bathing the cockpit in a soft emerald glow. As she pulled the canopy shut, the roar of the outside world muffled into a concentrated hum. She adjusted her headset, and for the first time in hours, she spoke into the comms. "Base Control, this is Sparrow 1-1. Requesting immediate departure, heading northwest. I have a priority clearance under Marshal Vance." There was a brief pause. Usually, this was where the back-and-forth arguing started. But this time, the voice that came back was crisp and almost nervous. "Copy, Sparrow 1-1. You are cleared for immediate takeoff. Wind is 10 knots from the east. The airspace is yours. Good luck out there." Avery pulled back on the collective, and the nose of the Apache dipped slightly before the entire 7-ton machine lifted off the ground. She felt that familiar stomach flip of gravity letting go. She pivoted the nose toward the jagged mountain range in the distance and pushed the cyclic forward. The desert floor began to blur beneath her. As she flew, the landscape changed from flat, dusty plains to harsh, rising rock formations. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the canyons. This was the dead zone, a place where radio signals went to die, and where the terrain was so vertical that even the most experienced pilots felt a sense of vertigo. Her mind drifted back to her team. She knew their names, their faces, and the names of the people waiting for them back home. They weren't just assets to be recovered. One was a medic who had joined the service to pay for nursing school. Another was a young navigator who had just celebrated his 21st birthday 2 weeks ago. They were out there, tucked into a narrow crevice of rock, running out of water and time. Suddenly, a red light began to blink on her secondary console. A high-pitched chirp echoed in her ear. Warning. Obstacle ahead, the automated voice stated calmly. Avery squinted through the canopy. A massive wall of dust and sand, known as a haboob, was rolling off the high plateau. It was a wall of grit thousands of feet high, moving like a slow-motion tidal wave. If she flew into that, the sand would sandblast her sensors and could potentially choke the engines. But if she flew around it, she would lose 20 minutes her team didn't have. Not today, she muttered to herself. She checked her topographical map. There was a narrow gorge, barely wide enough for the rotors, that cut underneath the plateau. It was a risky move. If the wind shifted, she'd be slammed into the canyon walls. But the gorge was deep enough that the sandstorm might pass right over the top of it. She dived. The Apache screamed as it dropped altitude, the rock walls rising up on either side of her like the jaws of a giant. She had to fly by hand now. The autopilot couldn't react fast enough to the jagged turns of the canyon. Her heart was pounding, her hands steady but tight on the controls. The scar on her neck felt hot, a ghost burn from the last time she had defied the elements. The air inside the canyon was turbulent. The helicopter bucked and kicked, fighting the crosswinds that sucked through the stone gaps. Avery felt the sweat beads rolling down her forehead. She was flying inches from disaster, the wingtips of the Apache seemingly grazing the ancient stone. "Come on, baby," she whispered to the machine. "Just a little further." For 5 minutes, it was a dance with death. The visibility dropped as stray plumes of dust drifted down from the storm above. She was flying almost entirely on instinct, feeling the weight of the air and reacting to the vibrations in the floorboards. Then, the canyon opened up. Avery burst through the other side of the gorge into clear, golden light. The sandstorm was behind her, a dark wall receding in her rear-view mirrors. She checked her coordinates. She was less than 10 miles from the extraction point. But as she crested the final ridge, her heart sank. The valley where her team was supposed to be wasn't quiet. She could see the flashes of small arms fire bouncing off the rocks below. Dark shapes were moving along the ridgeline, closing in on a small sandy outcrop where a single strobe light was flashing the signal from her team. They were being overrun. "Sparrow 1-1 to ground team," she radioed, her voice echoing with command. "I am on station. I see your strobe. Sit tight and keep your heads down. I'm coming in hot." A voice crackled through the static, weak and breathless. "Sparrow? Is that you? We thought nobody was coming." "I don't leave people behind," Avery said, flipping the safety covers off the weapon triggers. "The cavalry is here." She leaned the Apache into a steep bank, the powerful sensors locking on to the positions of the attackers. She wasn't just a pilot anymore. She was a guardian. And after what she'd gone through to get this helicopter, she wasn't about to let a single bullet touch her people. Avery gripped the controls so hard her knuckles turned white. Below her, the valley was a chaotic mess of shadows and muzzle flashes. Her team was pinned against a sheer rock face, trapped with nowhere to run. They were out of time, out of luck, and nearly out of hope. But Avery was finally there, and she had the firepower of an Apache at her fingertips. She didn't just rush in. A good pilot knows that speed is life, but precision is what saves people. She tilted the helicopter's nose down, the sensors on her helmet slaving the gun turret to her eye movement. Everywhere she looked, the 30mm chain gun followed. She saw a group of attackers moving toward the team's flank and squeezed the trigger. The heavy thud, thud, thud of the gun echoed through the cockpit, a comforting, rhythmic sound that pushed the enemy back into the rocks. "Ground team, I'm clearing a path," Avery shouted into her headset. "Move to the flat ledge on your north side. I can't land in this rubble. You're going to have to jump for the steps as I hover." We've got a wounded man. The voice crackled back through the stats as I hover. We've got a wounded man. The voice crackled back through the static. It was the medic. He sounded exhausted. We can't move fast, Sparrow. Give us 2 minutes. 2 minutes felt like an eternity in a hot zone. Avery circled the ledge like a protective hawk. She fired off a series of flares, the bright magnesium sparks lighting up the canyon and blinding anyone trying to take a shot at her team. The heat from the flares drifted upward, causing the helicopter to buffet in the thin air. Suddenly, a loud clunk vibrated through the floorboards. Avery's heart skipped a beat. A yellow warning light flickered on the right side of her instrument panel. Engine 2. Oil pressure. Low. Not now, she hissed. She checked her gauges. The oil pressure was dropping fast. Maybe a stray bullet from the ground had nicked a line, or maybe the stress of the canyon flight had finally pushed the machine too far. If that engine seized, she'd lose half her power. In this thin mountain air, flying a loaded Apache on one engine was like trying to ride a bicycle with one pedal while carrying a piano. It could be done, but there was no room for error. The helicopter began to groan. A low-frequency vibration started in the tail rotor, shaking her seat. Avery had a choice. She could pull back, gain altitude, and try to limp home before the engine died, or she could stay and finish the job. She looked down. She saw the 3 men below. They were carrying their wounded comrade on a makeshift stretcher, scrambling over jagged boulders toward the ledge. They were exposed. They were vulnerable. If she left now, they would never make it to the top of that ridge. Avery didn't hesitate. She shifted her weight, compensating for the loss of power by tilting the helicopter at an aggressive angle. She used the remaining momentum to sweep the ridgeline one last time, forcing the attackers to dive for cover. "Coming down," she announced. She brought the massive machine into a low, precarious hover. The rotor blades were spinning just feet away from the canyon wall, kicking up a blinding cloud of red dust. The vibration in the cockpit was getting worse. The shaking was so violent she could barely read her screens. The smell of hot oil began to seep into the cabin. "Go! Go! Go!" she yelled, though they couldn't hear her over the roar. She watched through her side mirrors. The medic scrambled onto the ledge first, reaching down to pull the stretcher up. They were moving in slow motion, hampered by the weight of their gear and the steepness of the rock. Every second she hovered, she was burning through her engine's life. The warning lights were now a steady, angry red. Chime! Chime! The computer was screaming at her to land immediately. "Sparrow, we're at the door," the radio barked. The team reached the side of the Apache. Because it wasn't a transport helicopter, there was no large cabin. The men had to secure themselves to the external points in the small storage areas on the cheeks of the aircraft, a desperate, last resort way to fly. They buckled themselves in, clinging to the machine as the dust swirled around them. "We're on! Get us out of here!" Avery pulled the collective. The Apache didn't rise. It shivered and sagged. The single working engine roared in protest, the RPMs dropping dangerously low. For a terrifying second, the helicopter began to slide backward toward the rock wall. Avery felt the scar on her neck throb. She remembered the crash 10 years ago, the sound of breaking glass and the smell of fire. She wasn't going to let it happen again. She pushed the throttle to the absolute limit, ignoring the overload warnings. She traded altitude for airspeed, dipping the nose and diving off the ledge into the open valley below. The drop gave the rotors enough bite to catch the air. The Apache leveled out just 50 feet above the valley floor, screaming across the desert at a speed the engine wasn't designed to handle. "Hang on back there," Avery shouted. She was flying low and fast, weaving through the terrain to keep the wind from stalling her remaining engine. The vibration was so intense now that her vision was blurring. She looked at her fuel and oil levels. She had maybe 10 minutes of flight time left before the second engine would likely overheat and quit. She glanced at her GPS. The base was still miles away. She wasn't going to make it back to the main airfield. "Base control," she called out, her voice straining against the noise of the dying machine. "This is Sparrow 1-1. I have the package, but I am losing Engine 2 and Engine 1 is redlining. I am not going to make the hub. I need an emergency landing strip. Anywhere." The radio was silent for a second, then a familiar voice broke through. It wasn't the controller. It was Vance. "Sparrow, this is Vance. I've been tracking your signal. There's an old abandoned salt flat 5 miles to your west. It's flat and hard. I'm already in a transport headed your way. Just get it on the ground, Avery. Get it down safe." Avery turned the bird west. The sun had finally vanished, leaving the world in a hazy blue twilight. The engine gave one final loud bang, and a trail of black smoke began to pour from the right turbine. The helicopter started to yaw violently to the left. She fought the controls, her muscles burning. She could see the white expanse of the salt flat ahead, glowing like a ghost in the dark. "Almost there," she whispered. "Just a little further." The engine sputtered and died completely when she was still 20 feet in the air. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. The Apache dropped like a stone. Avery pulled the flare at the last microsecond, cushioning the impact just enough. The helicopter hit the salt with a bone-jarring thud, skidding across the white surface for 50 yards before finally coming to a stop in a cloud of dust and steam. Avery sat in the sudden, ringing silence. Her hands were still gripped around the cyclic. She was breathing hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked in the mirror. Her team was already jumping off the side, bruised and battered, but alive. The medic gave her a shaky thumbs up before turning to help the wounded man. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. She had done it. But as she looked out the canopy, she saw the lights of a convoy approaching from the distance. And at the front of that convoy, she could see the silhouette of the man who had made it all possible. The dust from the crash landing slowly settled over the white salt flats, leaving a silence so deep it felt heavy. Avery sat in the cockpit for a long minute, her hands still frozen on the controls. The smell of hot metal and scorched oil filled the small space, but beneath it was the crisp, cool air of the desert night. She watched through the cracked glass as the headlights of the approaching convoy cut through the dark, getting larger and brighter. She reached up and unbuckled her helmet, letting it drop to the floor. Her ears were ringing, and every muscle in her body felt like it had been stretched to the breaking point. She climbed out of the seat, her legs feeling like jelly as she hit the ground. The salt crunched under her boots, a sound of safety. The transport vehicle skidded to a halt a few yards away. Doors flew open, and a team of medics rushed past her, heading straight for the 3 men huddled under the wing of the broken Apache. Avery watched them work, her eyes fixed on the wounded soldier she had pulled from the ridge. When she saw him lift a hand and grip the medic's arm, she finally let out the breath she felt she had been holding for 10 years. "Captain." She turned. Vance was walking toward her. He wasn't wearing his tactical jacket anymore. He just had on a plain shirt, looking more like a tired father than a high-ranking official. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the battered helicopter, then back at her. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the jagged scar on her neck, which was now covered in a fine layer of white salt dust. "You're late," he said, a small, tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Avery wiped her forehead with her sleeve. "I had a bit of a headwind, and a missing engine." and a sergeant who didn't want to give me the keys. Vance laughed softly and shook his head. Holloway is currently being re-educated back at the hub. I don't think he'll be stamping any papers for a very long time. Probably ever. They stood there together as the medics loaded the team into the transport. The medic who had spoken to her on the radio paused before getting into the ambulance. He looked at Avery Reilly, looked at her, and gave a slow, solemn nod. It wasn't the kind of nod you give a superior officer. It was the kind you give someone who has just handed you your life back. As the ambulance sped away toward the nearest field hospital, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Avery looked at the Apache. It was a wreck. The rotors were bent, the fuselage was scarred from small arms fire, and the engines were ruined. Under normal circumstances, a pilot would be facing a board of inquiry for bringing back a piece of equipment in that condition. "What happens now?" Avery asked, gesturing toward the downed bird. "The paperwork for this is going to be a nightmare. I broke about 15 different regulations today, Vance, maybe more." Vance stepped closer, his expression turning serious. "The paperwork is already gone. I've spent the last 2 hours on the satellite phone. That mission you just flew, it's being recorded as a high-priority training exercise that encountered an emergency. The men you saved, their records will show they were rescued by a coordinated task force. But your file is finally being cleaned up." Avery blinked. "Cleaned up?" "The reprimand from 10 years ago," Vance explained. "The disobedience that blocked your path. It's been struck from the record. In its place, there is now a commendation for bravery that was lost in the system. You aren't a rogue pilot anymore, Avery. You're exactly what you've always been. The best chance those boys had." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver coin, a tradition among soldiers, often given as a token of deep respect and shared history. He pressed it into her hand. "I couldn't give you a medal on that ridge 10 years ago," he said, "and I can't give you a parade today because of the nature of the work, but you'll never have to beg for a bird again. Every base in this sector knows your name now, and they know that if you're asking for something, it's because it's a matter of life and death." Avery looked down at the coin. In the moonlight, she could see the emblem of the unit she had saved back then. It felt heavier than it looked. For a decade, she had walked through the world feeling like she was an outsider, someone who did the right thing but was punished for it. She had worn her scar like a secret shame. Now, she realized the scar wasn't a mark of a mistake. It was a badge of honor that just hadn't been recognized yet. "Thank you, Vance," she said, her voice a little shaky, "for the helicopter, and for remembering." "I told you," Vance said, turning to walk back toward the command vehicle. "I have a daughter because of you." Remembering was the easy part. As the recovery crews arrived to begin the long process of hauling the Apache off the salt flats, Avery climbed into the back of Vance's transport. She leaned her head against the cool window and watched the site of the crash disappear into the darkness. She thought about the desk back at the hub, the system that tried to stop her, and the cold, unfeeling rules that almost cost 3 men their lives. They had dismissed her request because they didn't know who she was. They saw a pilot with no paperwork and a strange mark on her neck, and they thought she was nobody. But as she drifted off into a deep, well-earned sleep, she knew better. She wasn't just anyone. She was the pilot who came when the radio stayed silent. And the next time she walked into a hangar, no one would dare tell her to take a seat. The sun began to peek over the horizon as the convoy reached the main gates of the base. "Help!" The guards didn't check her ID 3 times. This time, they didn't make her wait. They saw the vehicle, they saw the pilot in the back, and they threw the gates wide open. Avery Thorne was finally home. And for the first time in 10 years, she didn't feel like she was hiding anything. She was just a pilot who had a job to do, and she had done it well.